Hey, Sarah.
Yes, Alex?
What do you think is like the hardest thing about me going out on dates?
When you come back?
Oh.
Welcome to Mistakes Were Made, a podcast about non-monogamy for messy people like us. I'm Sarah. I'm queer. I'm non-monogamous. I write stuff. I therapize people.
And I'm her husband, Alex. No one really understands what I do, and you know what? I like it that way.
And I'm Jessica here, producing, resident monogamist, semi-fun employed right now. I don't know if the semi applies to the fun or the employed part. I'll let you all think about that one.
So, Alex, I hear you're abandoning your family next weekend.
Excuse me?
Today's a very special episode of Mistakes Were Made. Alex is abandoning
So you
me.
found out about my plans to abandon my family. I assume you're referring to the planned trip that I have to go and visit one of my partners who's been away for several months that I have had on the books for weeks and that you consented to many times. Is that what you mean by I'm abandoning my family?
Yes, that's another way you could describe it. It's longer, it's wordier. I don't think that it has quite the punch, but sure.
It doesn't carry the same
Emotional weight.
cultural stigma, you might say. Yes. There's a better embedded kind of cultural story in abandoning your family, running away to San Diego with another woman. I think that actually, didn't that happen in E.T.? It's actually at the beginning of E.T. They were talking about how the dad ran away.
Well, what I remember about that is that the mom finds out that the dad went to Mexico with his new girlfriend, whose name is Sally. I remember this really well. Because, as a kid, I was always listening for the adult content in movies like that. And I'm like, oh, there's something interesting happening here. And the mom goes, but he hates Mexico, and runs out of the room crying. Am I remembering this right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sounds right.
So will be me next weekend. And you know how in E.T., then there's a shot of her standing at the sink and she's supposed to be doing dishes and the steam is billowing up from the hot water and there's just tears pouring down her face. Also me next weekend.
Cool. Well, I wish you luck with that. Hopefully an alien comes and touches your hearts and teaches you about the true meaning of life and goodness. And you learn more about the people right here on Earth that are closest to you.
You can count on it.
By an extraterrestrial. So anyway, yes. Why are we talking about this?
Because today we're talking about the experience of a partner leaving to spend time with another partner. And specifically about how the leaving and the coming back together and sort of everything that happens in between, but especially that the leaving and coming back together can be this point of anxiety and also a point of conflict for a lot of couples. And it certainly has been for us in the past. And something that we still sometimes struggle with. So it seemed like a good thing to talk about. I know that a ton of the relationships that I work with in my practice, a lot of the people I work with, this is something that we talk about a lot. So it seemed relevant. Mm-hmm. Timely for us as well.
Yes, totally. So do you think that's it's mainly about, is this an episode about jealousy specifically, or is it something else?
I mean, the more that we explore non-monogamy and talk about it on this podcast, and I think about it as a therapist, I realize that the term jealousy is not very nuanced. Mm-hmm. It's when we say jealous, what are we talking about?
Right.
Sure. Part of it is going to be that I'm jealous that you're going on a trip and I'm not going on a trip. And part of it might be that I feel jealous that you're going to be spending romantic, intimate time with someone who isn't me. And part of it might be that I'm jealous that you're not going to have to hang out with the kids.
Yeah.
And, there's all this stuff in there. There's feelings that I have about telling people where you are and their reactions to that, and that's
So
not
like shame more than jealousy.
maybe more than jealousy. There's just like the feeling of knowing that like a primary attachment figure and a person that I co-parent with and that like I just kind of like co-regulate with and figure out my life with and I'm, casually, regularly, physically intimate with is going to be gone and doing a lot of that stuff with somebody else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so like there's just, jealousy is a word that is in there, but I feel like there are a lot of other emotions and words in there too.
So this is like an experience that's pretty fundamental to the practice of non-monogamy or polyamory. Like by nature, your partner is going to be going and spending time with other partners. It feels like we haven't really talked about in the past that much. Like, what is that actual experience? Like the actual, like, they're going to like say goodbye, I'm leaving to go on this date or to go on this trip. And then like, you're going to have the experience of like the time when they're not there and that they're with that other partner. And then they're going to come back and be like, hello, I'm back. And there's all of those different like kind of touch points or those different experiences where you're going to have feelings. The people on both sides, the person who's like staying behind and the person who's leaving are going to have complex feelings that, are obviously like there's more to it than just like jealousy does not begin to describe it. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's like patterns that I've noticed here. With myself and with clients, I would say of like a kind of emotional detachment that starts before the separation as people kind of like prepare themselves for the separation. And then there can be some like anxiety that results from that, if that makes sense. Like people are I often hear clients describe like their partner is like seeming more cold and less interested in them as the separation sort of looms.
The partner who's staying behind is more cold and disinterested.
Yeah. And then that there is like a fear sometimes. I definitely experience this, like a fear of fighting before the person leaves. And so you're like being a little more like emotionally removed from each other because you're like trying to curate everything being just fine right up until the leaving, because it would make it worse if you were then separated and you'd had a fight right before. Or what are some other things? Like, it's not even that complicated. Like, you and I dropped our kids off at school today, right? And we all here have been children. And so there's, I think, right? I got receipts on Jessica. I don't know that I have receipts on you, Alex.
I was actually born completely formed adult.
Oh, so you are...
My body was smaller, but I was an adult from birth.
You were like the E.T.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Was E.T. actually a child alien, right?
That is a really great question that I cannot answer.
Well, write in and let us know the answer to that question.
E.T. was also experiencing a lot of separation anxiety, so I feel like this is like a really good...
That was like the whole thing, phone home.
Yeah, metatext for us to be working with here.
Yeah.
But what I was going to say is...
metatext. Media studies major over here. Holy shit. E.T. is a metatext for polyamory. And a PhD thesis by Sarah Studo. Okay.
You know what? Anyway. That's actually a great idea.
Yeah.
When you drop kids off at school... in the lead up to dropping them off, they start freaking out a little bit and like kind of beefing with you often. And then like the actual drop off, this doesn't happen all the time with our kids now, but there was a time with each of them when they would just be clinging to you and screaming and crying and don't go and I'm scared and please no, oh my God. Just like absolute panic, and you would just like be sort of like pulling them off of you like they were an octopus, and it just like felt so bad,
yeeting them through the door.
It just felt so bad. And then they would largely be totally fine and regulated while you were gone, and they would like do the routines of the school day and like have whole experiences and
forget that you were ever even existed.
That you ever even existed. And then you would come back together and they would initially be like, Mommy, yay, I'm so glad to see you. And then the countdown to 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I hate you. I'm hungry. I'm bored. And just like starting so much shit.
Yeah.
And I feel like that little, it's classic like separation anxiety. It's a really common experience for kids, for people. And I think that little arc is something that I still experience when you leave in a much less
infantile,
childish way, at least outwardly. And so, yeah, I mean, that's not exactly jealousy, right?
No,
There's something else
yeah.
that's going on there that's worth exploring.
Yeah, it sounds like it's attachment stuff. So what you're saying is this is not just a thing that happens with your clients, but it's a thing that you and I experience as well in our relationship.
What is it like for you, or what do you notice?
It depends on which role you're talking about. I think we've both had the experience of being the person who's staying behind and the person who's leaving, right? And so I guess it depends. In which one? Which one are you asking about?
Either.
Well, I guess what is present to me right now, since I'm like going on a trip, is like awareness of. I mean, I guess there's definitely like this sort of feeling of guilt that you're like abandoning your partner, especially when you have shared, like, we have a shared emotional life, but we also have shared like responsibilities. And so I'm like abandoning you to those responsibilities, which is a hard feeling that is kind of like, I mean, this is like an interesting situation because I just went on another trip also a couple weeks ago.
So this is the second abandoning.
Yeah, this is the second abandoning. The first abandoning was not anything related to non-monogamy. It was like a creative retreat with people who I'm not romantically involved with. There's a spiritual bromance perhaps involved, but
yeah, I was going to say, don't say not at all romantically involved with, because I think that would be wrong.
Okay, I don't want to say too much, but don't worry, none of them listen to this podcast.
They probably don't.
Listen to me. But that's a whole other story. Anyway, but so yeah, thinking about the differences between, I think all of that stuff was kind of there in that case as well, like the like responsibility and like, I'm kind of like, it's sometimes hard to like kind of cut loose and have fun and fully enjoy freedom the way that I do when I go away with you or like go out on a date with you. And I'm like, we paid a babysitter. And like, maybe I feel like a little bit of like, oh, I hope the kids are doing okay. But for the most part, I'm like enjoying together that, that sense of freedom.
You don't have to experience a sort of duality of joy and experience and pleasure and a kind of like guilt.
Yeah. And when I'm away with somebody else, then, who's not you, then I'm like, oh, I know that Sarah's carrying all of those responsibilities. And like, that makes me feel a little bit, I mean, I don't know. There's like the guilty feeling. And then there's also like the, guilt is a very like internal feeling. I think there's also like, I also pity you.
Great. That's great.
No, I don't know what the right word for it is, but it's like, I know what it feels like to be in that position. And it's like, it's not like it's terrible or anything like that, but there's.
I feel like we should do a hard cut, like, because Jessica is around when you go away on a trip and have kids and you're like, and I just know that you're struggling and I'm pitying you. And then there's like a hard cut to me and Jessica taking the kids to Chuck E. Cheese and like going on the roller coaster and eating McDonald's like 5 times a day and like buying Squishmallows.
Right.
Like they're, going out of style.
It's like a montage of you guys doing blow in the Chuck E. Cheese bathroom and like riding roller coasters. And
I'm like, yeah, there's a lot of suffering.
It's terrible.
Terrible
quiet,
suffering.
folding laundry until the wee hours of the morning.
Baking wheat bread.
Baking wheat bread.
Yeah, totally. And then all the wheat bread's gone when they get back. It's so weird.
Yeah, well.
They swear that's all they did. Anyway, so yeah, there's that piece. And then I'm trying to think like when it's like a romantic or like a, a date or a trip with a partner. I don't know about like the extra stuff is like around like care, I think, and like the feeling that like, what is hard about this for you? And, kind of like awareness of that and then like trying to figure out how to like be there for that, but also
be okay with it.
Be okay with it, I guess. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I guess the second part is hard for me, and it's very easy to take your partner's feelings about a thing that you do and not turn that into a self-referential feeling.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I am the cause of this hard feeling that you're having. And so that makes it harder to like hold that feeling with you rather than feel defensive about it. Mm-hmm. This is kind of like the conundrum of maybe relationships in general.
Yeah, I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting. So I'm thinking about like way earlier, maybe even before you guys had opened up your marriage, but like we had friends who were a couple who had an open marriage. And I remember I was so curious, like, how does it work? Whatever. And I remember, I think you telling me, Sarah, that like one rule they had was that like you couldn't like leave your partner home babysitting when you went out on a date. Is this ringing a bell?
Huh.
Leave your partner home babysitting?
Yeah. Like which like now thinking about it, I'm just like, how would you be a married couple with children and do that?
Oh, like they would have to
like
be
they would
out
have
also?
to get a babysitter and both be out doing different things or something like that. It's funny because I think when I first heard that, I was like, oh, well, obviously, because that would be so unfair, right? And then now that I've had some time to...
Yeah. I think that's starting to speak to, or like your perspective on that back then is starting to speak to like some of the like external judgments about non-monogamy that are really easy to like buy into kind of instinctually because of society or whatever. Like that makes sense. Like sort of if you're just like, yeah, this is sort of fundamentally wrong. So of course the idea that like you would be at home taking care of like a small baby while your partner was out gallivanting around town is like too much to bear. Mm-hmm. And then so there should be some workaround for that, which would be like getting a babysitter. And you can kind of be like, yeah, totally, that makes sense. Like, but then like once you take away that part that like it's objectively just sort of too much to bear because it's just like wrong, then it makes a lot less sense. And you're like, you're wasting a lot of fucking money on babysitters.
Right.
Right.
And it's like creating also this false sense of sort of like fairness being both of you doing the exact same thing at the exact same time all the time, right?
I think fairness is a big one here, and I have so much to say about it, but it's almost definitely with clients, if I hear there's like this real intense emphasis on fairness, I just am like, y'all, I absolutely understand why you're talking about that, and I can absolutely promise you it's not going to work. Like, that's the wrong tool for the job. Fairness, the idea that, like, one person will do one thing and then the other person will do the other thing, or they'll do it at the same time, or there will be this kind of tallying of activities and it will always balance out. Like, the balance sheet will stay in the black or whatever. It just never works. And the instinct to do that, I think, in general in non-monogamy, definitely once you're non-monogamous and parenting is really, really strong. And maybe is somewhat informed by what you were just describing, Alex, that this is inherently seen as something that is bad. And so we're constantly doing a lot of extra labor to try and like mitigate what we see as like immoral or unethical or sort of inexcusable about it. And fairness is one of the things that we think might help. But yeah.
I'm curious, why do you think that doesn't work? Like, why do you advise? I mean, I guess based on like seeing it not work, but like, do you think there's a sort of fundamental reason?
I mean, zooming way out, it might be that I don't think fairness exists. So I don't know.
Yeah. Okay, zoom back in a little more.
Okay, I'll zoom back in a little more. I think it's because people are not exactly the same. Mm-hmm. And the world is a complex place, and relationships by definition involve other people, and polyamorous relationships involve multiple other people. And so the material is too organic and too nuanced and too like complex and mercurial for the idea of fairness, for that tool to be effective. Like, we're not talking about M&Ms between my kids, right? We are talking about feelings and time and emotions and intimacy. And these can't even just be measured in terms that can be meted out in equal, fair ways.
Yeah. Agree. Hard agree on all of that. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I was just going to, so like with trips, taking trips with a partner that is not your spouse, you guys have done this a few different times now. Each of you have gone on trips, I think, with partners. So I guess I'm curious to ask, like, how have you figured it out? You're still sitting here. You still love each other very much. Well, you're still making a podcast about relationships.
I think the fairness thing here is pretty complicated between me and Alex on this particular one. I don't know how you feel about it, but I don't do it as much as Alex does. I don't go on trips with romantic partners as much as he does. Not to say you do it a ton, but like if we were to do an accounting, it would look really different between the two of us. And so I think it is tempting to get into that, like, it's not fair, or he should do less, or I should do more. And certainly, like, I sometimes feel like our community is aware of this balance sheet and is sometimes employing it at different points for different reasons. I do plenty of trips. Like, I did a big creative trip, or a creative, like, retreat trip with a friend that was 5 days over the summer. I've done something like that almost every year since the kids were born. I once did a 2-week-long writing residency when the kids were really young. I go on trips with my friends, my chosen family, sometimes family members. But for me, romantic partners, trips with romantic partners have been fewer and further between. And I could get into the why on my side with that, but I'll let you maybe respond with your thoughts about this, Alex.
Yeah, I guess there was, like, I heard you kind of saying a minute ago, 2 different things about why fairness doesn't work that I think are important. Like, one, relationship, and they're related, but like relationships involve other people is like a big one, right? You can't really, if you went into it being like, it's so self-referential. If you start as a couple and are like, we're going to do everything exactly on the same schedule and like make sure that everything is completely fair, it just kind of like speaks to this idea that like you can have the primacy of your primary partnership be really primary. There's a lot of primaries in that sentence, but other people are going to be involved unless you're like hiring sex workers or whatever. You're not going to be able to like do that.
And they're also people.
They're all, yes, of course. But like in theory, you could be like, and I'm going to hire a sex worker on Monday, and so you get to on Tuesday or whatever. But short of that, like as an exaggerated example, you can't just make the world bend to your, petty accounting of what's fair or not fair. Like there's going to be people in those relationships that are going to affect the way that they happen. And I guess the other part of, I love it when you say, I was not trying to imply that sex workers aren't people. Jesus Christ.
Canceled.
Headline.
Canceled, Alex. You're canceled.
Title this episode, Alex says sex workers aren't people. Some of my best friends are sex workers, Sarah. Okay, that's not actually true either, but the other...
there's been a lot of phrases in this podcast so far that I feel like could go on merch for us.
Ooh.
Yeah.
ET is the metatext for non-monogamy is one of them. It's society or whatever, in quotes, is another one. And all of my friends are sex workers might be a third.
Have you seen the lady who puts stuff like that on booty shorts? So you're like looking at somebody's ass, and then it says like ET is a metatext for blah blah blah.
No, please send it to me.
Yeah, it's great.
Great idea.
Anyway, the other one was that people aren't the same. So like trying to do and we were talking about that this morning. Like I think a lot of people's like strong relationships are built around complementary personalities, not like the same personality. Right. So trying to like go into an emotionally challenging endeavor like non-monogamy and being like, this is going to work exactly the same for both of us. And we're going to want to do the same things on the same schedule. Like, I think it's quickly going to emerge in most cases that like you don't want to do the same things on the same schedule, and like things that are hard for one person are easy for the other person, and vice versa. And like, one person doesn't really like going on trips like that, and they like doing other stuff, and the other person, does, and they don't like doing other stuff. And so like the accounting doesn't work very well.
Yeah. That's true.
But with that said, I've only gone on like 2 more trips than you, so I don't know.
I knew that was coming.
Not that you're counting.
Not that I'm counting, but I took a tally here on my note sheet.
I was wondering what those little hash marks were.
I'm always curious, like, sort of how you establish sort of rules or guidelines. Like, how do you decide? I don't know. Not that, again, we're not like counting. There's no scale, I guess, apparently. You don't have an allotment of a certain number of, vacation days per year that you're allowed to take with another partner. But like how do you make those kind of decisions in the first place? How do you figure it out,
I mean, big picture, I would say both of us, if one of us comes to the other one and says there's something that we want to do, you and I seem to share the value that we want to try and make it possible. I think in that sense, we have, we never use the word compersion on this podcast, which is funny because it's a podcast about non-monogamy.
Yeah.
But
Can you tell us what that means just real quick?
Compersion is the idea that you can take pleasure in your partner's pleasure or someone else's pleasure, that you experience genuine pleasure there. And I have always felt resistant towards that term because I felt judged by it. I feel judged by a lot of terms in non-monogamy, I'm realizing, and a lot of books and a lot of memes and so I'm insecure. What I'm realizing right now is I'm insecure. Okay, moving on. And I think that I just was like, I'll never be able to experience that because it's too hard. Like the attachment stuff, the jealousy, like the fear, it's too difficult and I'm never going to get there. But there are ways that I am there and we are kind of naturally there that are easy for us. And so we don't think about it. And I think this is one of those. Like over the course of our relationship, and especially more and more, I can't think of a time that one of us has come to the other and said, there's something I really want to try and do. And the other person wasn't like, I really want to help you do that.
Yeah. Yeah, but I do think there's a bit of a transformation in understanding from like, I think a few years ago when we started doing and did more overnight trips with partners, there was a little bit more of a like keeping track kind of thing going on. And like, one of us would decide to do it and then the other one would kind of be like, okay, well now I can,
right, because
you did. And then like, it would sort of be kind of tracked in that way. And I definitely think now, I mean, partly we kind of decided, well, we don't necessarily like as a general core value in our relationship or in like our practice of non-monogamy, like doing that much. Or perhaps that was kind of like you saying, I'm not really getting that much out of doing this.
Right. At the height of that, we were doing weekly overnights, both of us. So at any given week, one of us would be out at least one time overnight. And then there was also trips. And then there were also like other partners sometimes. So there was just like there was a lot of activity.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of us being apart. And I think like what we kind of came to was not that any of those things were off the table, if that was ever important or something that someone wanted to do, back to that bigger value that we would want to make that happen. But that as a just like, this is the norm of how we practice it, it felt really hectic and complicated. And I think I'll speak for myself. I felt like we were having a harder time just finding time for our relationship and being together. And that didn't feel good.
Yeah, I agree with that. It can kind of feel like a race to the bottom, or I guess a race to the top of doing more of that stuff in, if you're just always kind of tallying like, oh, well, this person is doing this, so then I can do that. And then, you end up just doing a lot. And I think we kind of did that.
Yeah.
And the combination of that and trying to like appease what we thought that our partners wanted. And this is definitely something I'm guilty of kind of like assuming that my other partners always want more. And then like, just kind of like, I think this was like an early sort of fundamental mistake that I made in non-monogamy of just being like, they're always going to want more and I'm always going to not be doing enough. So wherever there's space to do more in those relationships, like the way that I can like earn people's love or whatever is by like showing up more And so like obscure how unavailable I am and, you know, do a lot of stuff and like not have the boundaries that I have.
And I think for me, you know, as we've talked about on this podcast before, I have a lot of long, low arc relationships in my life, and that is how I build trust with people. When I come to trust people, I trust them really deeply, and I am incredibly loyal, and I am very vulnerable in those relationships, and they are extremely meaningful to me. And that trust and that intimacy does not come quickly for me. And when I try and do it too soon or too often with someone where I just don't actually have that trust built up yet, it is the opposite of relaxing. It feels really stressful. And I think I had gotten to a point with some of the overnights and the trips where I was out of touch with what actually felt good and connective to me and where I felt relaxed and where I was just like stretching myself and my nervous system endlessly trying to keep up with what I thought was how you were supposed to do this, basically.
Man, yeah, this is just all making me think about something in my own relationship, monogamous as it may be. Like, I just keep having this idea that like we really need to establish like how much is okay for like me to go out and be doing something while Curtis stays at home, and you know, and I just keep thinking like it should be once a week or it should be once a month or whatever. And like if we just figure out that number, then it'll be settled. It'll be fine. It'll be figured out. And it's just really making me realize how much that is like a shortcut for whatever the underlying like issue is that we really need to figure out and make sure that we're on the same page about. And it's not really about how many nights per week or month or year I go out with my friends.
Yeah, it's not about quotas necessarily.
And that is so tempting. And I know we like talk a lot about containers and expectations in non-monogamy. I think that is important. Like there are boundaries and containers and like ways that we co-create relationship, and we talk about what works for us, and like sometimes that might be routine around how often you go out or what you do or don't do. But we have to also just be like flexible and understand that most conflict is not actually about the thing you're fighting about.
Right.
I mean, it's not actually about the logistics. It's about the feelings behind them.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in therapy, they talk about how anger, for example, is often a secondary emotion that is typically covering up fear or sorrow and sadness, I would say. And so that's one of the things I think about with conflict between people is like the anger is valid, and I don't want to invalidate anger. I think that it's a really important emotion and very real, but sometimes it can be a cover for something else more kind of like subterranean that is happening that people are avoiding.
Let's take a break. Oh, go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say you'd been doing some late night internet research.
Oh, yeah.
Well, actually, I believe Alex is our Reddit correspondent for the podcast.
He is. And you were just like digging up some stories or like requests for help or experiences that people had shared on some of the online forums from polyamory about how hard the leaving, the coming back, and the experience in between can be, especially early on.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really have to dig. It's honestly like on like the non-monogamy Reddit, I swear, like every other post is like a new person being like, I thought I was totally cool with this, but then now my partner's on their first date and I'm totally freaking out. It's like a very common experience, I think, that like almost everybody has. And, you know, sometimes I think some people kind of like say that it goes away, but it's, I think, a thing that like almost everybody or like a lot of people are experiencing and like seeking advice on. And so I thought it was kind of interesting to like dig into some of that, like what is some of the advice, and maybe like share a little bit of like kind of what we do. Not that it's perfect. But like, yeah, so here's one person saying like, I opened up my relationship with my long-term partner and consistently have panic attacks when they're on dates. I do want non-monogamy logically, but my body goes into fight or flight, panic, nausea, the works. How long did you, if you did experience this, does it go away? What tools did you use to help with it? It's hard on my physical health and immune system.
Can I just, I'm like looking over your shoulder, and the title of that post is, when do the panic attacks go away?
Yeah.
Yeah, which is like intense. And yeah, so like people want there to be a fix, and then they also feel like there's something wrong with them. This is another one. My wife had her first solo date last night, and my insecurities are getting the better of me. How do I deal with it? And I guess like just to get into some of the like things that people say. So in this one, it's like one of the responses, I like to plan a bunch of special stuff for myself that I don't tend to do when my partner's home. I'll get takeout from a place he doesn't like, watch a show he's not into, eat potato chips in the bathtub, let the dogs on the bed, to distract myself, and also as something positive to look forward to when he's away.
I would point out that that person is responding to something. That response is not to the scale of the question and concern. You know, so one of the things that I kind of notice when this comes up for people is like, if you experience attachment panic or separation anxiety, people who don't experience that telling you what they do can feel really alienating. Like, someone is having panic attacks.
Right.
They are terrified. They're having a neurosystem response to what is happening. And people are like, get yourself a special meal. It's like, okay.
Take those potato chips right in the bath.
Into the bathtub. And I'm like,
get crazy, girl.
Okay, so that is spoken like someone who does not have that response to a partner going on a date. And it makes me feel a lot of feelings. I'll let you continue, but I just kind of wanted to point that out, that if you're sensing that there's a mismatch there, I think it's because there is.
Yeah. And so this is another response. At first, I would distract myself with housework and exercise, but that wasn't changing how I felt, and I was stopping my wife from having a good time. She could see me struggling and hated it, and would ruin the good vibes she came home with. So yeah, they're kind of like acknowledging the way that it impacts the other partner as well, and like trying to figure out how to deal with that. Like, like, do you share that with your other partner? Do you share it with someone else? And
that's really hard too, because for the partner who's not experiencing it and is maybe like is able to access like a little easier joy and pleasure in non-monogamy, there's a lot of guilt that comes with that. And it's a lot for them to navigate too. And so I just want to acknowledge that does happen on both sides.
Yeah.
There are things that are hard there.
And I'm reading from two separate ones here and kind of mixing them. But like, here's another person saying, don't dump your insecurities on her. Give it at least 24 hours before you share your side of the night. Let her enjoy her feelings, the feelings she's having right now. Go take a walk, do something active. Don't sit with your thoughts. If it helps you, write them out, but don't share them. If you share too many negatives in the beginning, it can sour and kill future activity. And then somebody else said, you can also call a friend and dump on them. Which again, like to your point, I think this is like these well-meaning responses are kind of like belittling the level of emotional intensity of like the feelings. And
this is a little bit of an aside, but it reminds me of when I had postpartum depression, and people would talk to me about how having a new baby was hard in terms that felt like they were from a different planet. I'm like, felt like I was struggling to stay alive. And they were like, don't forget to take a shower. And I was like, what?
Yeah.
Okay. It's just like when you're experiencing really like high intensity emotional distress or mental health challenges, like that stuff just falls so flat, even though it's like kind and well-meaning, but it's just like not addressing the complexity of the experience that the person is having or the acuity of it.
Yeah, I think the expectation that like these things will this level of feelings will just resolve really quickly. In one of these posts, it's like, it's from 3 days ago, and the person posts it, and then they respond like literally a day later and are like, you know what, I talked it out with my friend and it's all better. And like, I figured it out, and like, I'm paraphrasing what it read like to me. Like, I'm a whole person now, and I've transcended the feelings of jealousy and the panic that I was experiencing. And I'm just like, I don't know if you should expect that of yourself. Like,
but like, it is so hard, because it's like, on the one hand, I totally understand, I have had a panic attack before in my life, and I know that no amount of potato chips in the bathtub is gonna like address the issue. And also, I feel like so many of the things that I have easily accessible to me are, of the order of potato chips in the bathtub, taking a walk, writing in my journal. Like, what
advice do I actually have?
I do? Yeah.
I mean, I think that this is where I get out my little soapbox about like therapy and attachment and staying close to your feelings and believing that they have something important to tell you about yourself. And I know that at first glance it might be you're afraid that the important thing that they have to tell you is that you can't do non-monogamy. And I want to say, as someone who has had those experiences and continues to like learn about them and orient myself around them, that is not necessarily what they mean. It can be what they mean, but often what they are telling you is that you have attachment, trauma, and wounding in your past that needs attention. And, for me, when I think about the challenges around leaving and coming back together, as I have done like a deeper dive into my own mental health, as I've gone to therapy, as I've become a therapist, as Alex and I have gone to therapy together, I've learned a lot about my earlier life, and specifically experiences I had with caregivers that contribute to that feeling of insecurity and fear and panic. So we started at the top of this podcast talking about little kids having that separation anxiety. For some of us, I also mentioned postpartum here a moment ago. For some of us, if very early in our lives, we had the experience of a caregiver being inconsistent, our needs not being taken care of, maybe they didn't come back. Maybe they didn't come back when we asked them to. This also could happen like really, really early on in life. I think this is not always the case, but sometimes if you have a parent who is struggling with mental health issues when you are very, very young, you can have inside your sort of nervous system this fear that your basic needs will not be taken care of, that person maybe won't come back, that person won't come back in a consistent way. And this is like, as you're developing, these first years of life are where like all of those connections are being made. And that's not to blame the caregivers. I want to be really careful here in saying they also have struggles and needed support and needed like care that they probably didn't get. And so I just want to hold all of that at the same time. There's something, if you want to get really brainy about it, there's something called object impermanence. There is a moment in development as a baby where you come to understand that if a person is not in front of you, it doesn't mean that they cease to exist or you cease to exist to them, right? That you come to understand through like attuned, consistent caregiving, ideally, that even if your caregiver goes away, they will come back. And if you cry out in a certain way, they will return. And that you can feel like some security in that. A lot of us didn't have that experience. A lot of people in this world did not have that experience. As you develop, like, do you have a parent who disappeared for long periods of time, whether emotionally or physically? Did you have a parent with an addiction? Did you have like traumatic experiences at really developmentally important moments with caregivers or people you depended on for your like safety? I know, like, for me as a teenager, I had a huge fight with my parents. I had a really, really challenging relationship with my parents as a teen. and left to go stay at a friend's house because we had a huge blowout. And when I tried to come back afterward, the locks on my house had been changed and I wasn't let back in. And that was effectively the last time I ever lived in my parents' house. So for me, the idea of like coming back and asking to be let back in to intimacy and care is particularly charged. This is part of the things that, like, I think non-monogamy, if you are willing to engage with like the feelings it brings up for you and be curious about them and not be afraid of them and not just try and fix them, they have so much to teach you about who you are. Mm-hmm. And it isn't all just about like sex and romance and dates and overnights. It's literally about who you are, how you relate to people. How do you feel safe? When don't you feel safe? Why? And I think that's the advice that I would give people. And I know that that is like problematic advice to give. You know, my clients will come in and they'll be struggling with something like this. And I'm like, you each need individual therapists and you need to be going to couples therapy. And you probably should see your primary care physician and see if you need some help with the panic attacks. And it's really tempting to be like, well, that's insane. If we have to do all of that to do non-monogamy, we shouldn't do non-monogamy. And I'm like, maybe not.
Right.
It could very well be that the answer for you is that this is not the right way into that self-knowledge, or this isn't where we want to go.
That was going to be my question, is like, would you advise that, like, if you decide that you're such a person, like, is it just not for you? But it sounds like that's not what you're...
That's not what I'm saying. You know, I have this... There's this, like, phrase I think about, like, torturing yourself into enlightenment. Mm-hmm. And I think about it because I struggle with it. Like, I have a tendency to be like, what is the most painful thing? What is the scariest thing? What is the hardest thing? All right, let's do a deep dive right into the center of that and just like inure ourselves against it. And that's how I'm going to get enlightened. That's how I'm going to get beyond these feelings that are uncomfortable and I don't like. And that is a strategy. But I think as I learn more about how our minds and bodies work, as I learn more about how relationships work, as I learn more about non-monogamy, I think more about just being like kind and gentle with difficult feelings that come up. And difficult feelings don't mean this is wrong necessarily. And they don't mean we have to fix them or bail. And they don't mean we have to just like turn the volume up on them as high as we can and just like blow out our entire nervous systems. There are other options here where we recognize that like these things come up for a reason. We can be interested in those reasons. We can seek support from each other around finding out more about them. We can understand that there are ways that we are the same and different. I don't know if that actually answers your question about what advice I have to people, but that's what comes up for me, I guess, in response.
Yeah, absolutely. It really, really does. Well, and it leads me to another question. It just makes me